Across the dense forests and fortified hills of Western Europe, German soldiers sat comfortably inside their bunkers. Thick concrete walls, steel doors, and machine guns humming like mechanical beasts. They had repelled countless attacks before, and to them, the American infantry was just another wave of men rushing toward inevitable death. Inside one bunker along the Siegfried Line, a group of German soldiers joked as they brewed coffee on a small field stove. The air was calm, filled with overconfidence. "These Americans," one laughed, "they bring rifles to break our walls." Another tapped the cold concrete beside him and smirked. "This is our armor. They can't touch us." But outside, beyond the fog and tree line, a new kind of weapon was being prepared. American combat engineers knelt beside a strange piece of equipment. Two cylindrical tanks strapped together, a thick hose attached to a metal nozzle. It looked primitive, almost improvised. Yet within those tanks lay something far more terrifying than bullets or shells: liquid fire. The Germans had heard rumors about flamethrowers from the Pacific, but dismissed them as jungle weapons. Effective against bamboo huts and caves, perhaps, but useless against reinforced bunkers. They laughed at the thought of Americans trying to burn their way through Europe. Then came the silence before the storm, the whir of pressure valves, the hiss of fuel igniting, and suddenly the quiet battlefield erupted into an inferno. Flames shot forth in a violent arc, crawling along trenches, clinging to walls, devouring everything in their path. The laughter inside the bunker turned to screams. Concrete didn't melt, but the air inside did. In a matter of seconds, the weapon they mocked had transformed the battlefield into hell itself. From that day forward, no German soldier ever laughed at the sight of the American M2 flamethrower before the flames roared across Europe, before the bunkers burned. The N2 flamethrower was born out of pure desperation. In the early years of World War II, American engineers studied reports coming from Europe and the Pacific. They saw how entrenched enemies, hidden in bunkers, pillboxes, and caves, could resist endless gunfire and artillery. Bullets couldn't bend around corners. Explosives could collapse walls, but they couldn't drive enemies out. What could force a man to abandon his stronghold? The answer was simple and terrifying: fire. At the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, engineers and scientists gathered around crude, steel prototypes. Early flamethrowers were heavy, unreliable, and often just as dangerous to the operator as to the enemy. But the U.S. military saw potential. A psychological weapon, a tool that didn't just destroy, it broke the human spirit. The result was the M2 flamethrower, a weapon that could project a stream of burning gasoline, up to 40 yards. 2 cylindrical tanks carried the fuel. 1 gasoline, 1 compressed nitrogen, while a small ignition system turned that fuel into a continuous blast of fire. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't pretty. But on the battlefield, it didn't need to be. When the first demonstrations were held, soldiers watched in stunned silence. A single burst from the M2 turned a mock bunker into a furnace within seconds. The smell of burning fuel lingered in the air, heavy and unforgettable. Commanders nodded grimly. They understood what this meant. This wasn't a support weapon. This was a fear weapon. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence received scattered reports of American firemen carrying strange tanks into combat. The Wehrmacht dismissed them as impractical, too slow, too vulnerable, too short-ranged, they said. But what they didn't understand was that the M2 wasn't meant to trade shots with rifles. It was designed to end the fight before it even began. And soon, on the battlefields of Europe, they'd learn that fire, once unleashed, shows no mercy. The year is 1944. The Allies are advancing east, pushing the battered German army back toward its homeland. But just ahead lies something far more formidable than open fields or ruined towns. A wall of concrete and steel, known as the Siegfried Line, stretching over 630 kilometers. This defensive network was Hitler's pride, an iron barrier built to halt any invasion of Germany. Massive pillboxes, fortified machine gun nests, interlocking trenches, and underground bunkers lay hidden beneath layers of soil and camouflage. Every approach was calculated, every firing angle pre-planned. To the Germans, it was impenetrable. To the Americans, it looked like hell itself. In the dim interior of a German bunker, machine gunners waited behind slits of reinforced concrete. Their MG-42s, Hitler's buzzsaws, pointed toward open killing zones. Outside, American soldiers crouched low, pinned down by a storm of bullets. Every time they tried to advance, the air ripped with gunfire. Grenades bounced harmlessly off concrete walls. Artillery shells cratered the earth, but left the bunkers standing firm. To the men on the ground, these bunkers were monsters, silent until they roared, and nearly impossible to silence in return. One soldier later wrote in his journal, "You could throw everything you had at them, and they'd still be shooting." It felt like the bunkers were alive, breathing, watching, waiting for us. For days, the Americans tried conventional tactics, flanking maneuvers, explosives, even tanks, but the bunkers kept holding. The only thing the Germans feared was fire, and they were about to meet it face to face. As the evening fog rolled over the Siegfried Line, a new kind of weapon crept forward through the haze. 2 soldiers carried what looked like a pair of metal cylinders strapped to a man's back, connected by hoses and a nozzle. The Germans inside watched through their narrow viewports, puzzled. They had no idea what was about to happen. The weapon's pilot valve turned. The hiss of pressurized gas filled the silence. And then, a jet of flame erupted. The fog hung thick over the German lines, swirling around shattered trees and twisted metal. In the eerie quiet, between bursts of gunfire, the sound of footsteps echoed faintly through the mist, deliberate, heavy, and unhurried. The Germans inside their concrete bunkers could hear movement, but couldn't see who or what was coming. Then through the haze, a dark silhouette emerged, a single American soldier carrying a strange-looking apparatus on his back. A hose coiled around his arms like a serpent. The Germans aimed their rifles, waiting for the figure to step into the open. But before they could fire, a burst of searing orange light split the gray air. A torrent of flame roared out of the M2 flamethrower's nozzle, cutting across the fog like a living creature. The jet of burning fuel struck the side of the bunker, splattering against its entrance and crawling up the walls. The flame clung to everything it touched: dirt, concrete, and air itself, devouring oxygen and flooding the fortification with unbearable heat. Inside, the Germans screamed as the temperature soared. The air became thick with smoke and the stench of burning oil. Metal warped, and ammunition began to cook off, detonating chaotically in the confined space. Outside, the American troops watched in grim silence. The flamethrower operator, drenched in sweat beneath his heavy gear, kept the stream steady, sweeping it across the entrance until the bunker glowed red with heat. It wasn't just destruction, it was psychological warfare. No amount of courage or training could prepare a soldier to face fire like this. A fire that moved with intent, as if alive. Within minutes, the machine gun fire stopped. The once invincible bunker had fallen silent. When the flames finally died down, only smoke rose from the blackened structure. The Americans advanced cautiously, rifles raised, expecting return fire that never came. The Siegfried Line had faced artillery, tanks, and bombs before, but never something that could turn its very walls into an oven. For the first time, the Germans realized that their greatest fortifications had a weakness, and that weakness burned hotter than anything they'd ever faced. Beneath its terrifying reputation, the M2 flamethrower was, in essence, a marvel of brutal engineering simplicity. Strapped to a soldier's back, the weapon consisted of 2 fuel tanks and 1 smaller pressurized nitrogen cylinder. The tanks carried a mixture of gasoline and thickened fuel, napalm, as it would later be perfected, that allowed the flame to stick and crawl across surfaces like liquid fire. A hose connected the tanks to a handheld wand, fitted with an ignition system. First, a mechanical spark, later a more reliable electrical igniter. When the operator pulled the trigger, the nitrogen gas forced the pressurized fuel down the hose and out the nozzle in a violent stream. The jet of burning fuel could reach up to 40 meters, turning a single soldier into a walking inferno. The thick, gelatinous fire didn't just burn, it clung, it smothered, it consumed. Concrete didn't save you. Bunkers became ovens. Trees caught and held the flame. Vegetation burned for minutes. Even the sound was terrifying, a roaring, hissing bellow that echoed across the battlefield like a beast unleashed. To the Germans, who had grown accustomed to predictable weapons, rifles, machine guns, mortars, the flamethrower felt like something out of their nightmares. It bypassed armor, ignored cover, and shredded morale. Reports from the front described soldiers abandoning fortified positions the moment they saw the telltale flicker of fire arcing through the air. Flamethrower troops quickly became some of the most feared and most targeted men in the American ranks. Yet behind the monstrous effectiveness of the M2 was also immense courage. Operating it meant carrying nearly 70 pounds of fuel on your back. A literal bomb waiting to ignite if hit. Every man who shouldered one knew he was painting a target on himself. But when that trigger was pulled, fear shifted sides. The M2 didn't just win battles. It changed the psychology of warfare, turning the very concept of safe cover into a deadly illusion. By late 1944, the M2 flamethrower had become one of the Allies' most dreaded and decisive weapons in the European theater. On the outskirts of Aachen, near the Siegfried Line, a series of German pillboxes stood like concrete monsters, their machine guns cutting through American advances. Each bunker was a fortress of reinforced steel and stone, built to withstand artillery, grenades, and even tank shells. But the flamethrower would reveal their one fatal weakness: air. As American troops pressed forward, infantrymen with M1 rifles and Thompson submachine guns kept the defenders pinned, while the flamethrower operators crawled closer, inch by inch, through mud and debris. The roar of MG-42s filled the air, bullets tearing through the foliage around them. Every step closer was a gamble between life and death. The operator would kneel, brace himself, and aim the wand toward the narrow firing slit of the pillbox, the only opening. Then came the hiss, the ignition, and the eruption of a furious orange flame that surged into the bunker like a living creature. Inside, the effect was immediate and horrifying. The fire consumed the oxygen in seconds, forcing the defenders to gasp and choke as the walls turned into furnaces. Even if the flame didn't reach them directly, the heat and smoke made survival impossible. German soldiers stumbled out screaming, their morale collapsing faster than their defenses. Entire positions that had held firm against artillery crumbled under the psychological terror of a weapon that could melt steel and flesh alike. Witnesses later recalled that after the first wave of flamethrower assaults, the Germans began abandoning fortifications even before the Americans reached them. The illusion of safety within thick concrete had shattered. No wall felt strong enough, no cover secure. What artillery couldn't break? The M2 purified by fire. The flamethrower wasn't just a tactical tool. It was a symbol of unstoppable aggression. Where it appeared, resistance burned away, leaving only smoldering ruins and stunned silence. The true power of the M2 flamethrower went far beyond its technical specifications or its destructive reach. It was the terror it instilled in those who faced it. On both the eastern and western fronts, soldiers had seen unimaginable horror, but nothing prepared the German infantry for the sight of men carrying fire itself into battle. Reports soon circulated through German lines, whispered in trenches, passed along in frightened tones about American fire soldiers who could reduce bunkers to ash within seconds. This fear was not exaggerated. Entire platoons began abandoning their defensive positions the moment a flamethrower team appeared on the horizon. The hiss of ignition and the deep, roaring burst of flame carried across the battlefield like a warning from hell. Even armored crews, hidden inside tanks, described the sound as inhuman, a weapon that didn't just kill, but erased. Psychological warfare took its hold. Commanders tried to reassure their men that the flamethrower's range was limited, that it was slow, that one shot could disable the operator. But fear doesn't respond to logic. Soldiers who had witnessed the aftermath, the charred remains of bunkers, the blackened air, the twisted metal, couldn't forget what they'd seen. For many, surrender became preferable to burning alive. The Americans understood this effect and used it strategically. Before an assault, the mere presence of flamethrower operators, even before firing a single burst, was often enough to force a retreat. The sight of those twin tanks gleaming in sunlight, the steady advance through smoke, turned courage into panic. In one recorded instance near the Saar River, a single M2 operator advanced on a heavily fortified German position. Without firing a shot, the defenders raised a white flag. They had seen what happened to the bunker next to them, and they would not share its fate. The M2 flamethrower had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of psychological dominance, a force that turned hardened veterans into trembling shadows of their former selves. In the chaos of war, fire didn't just destroy. It rewrote the very definition of fear. Behind every burst of flame that terrified the enemy was a man who carried death on his back, his enemies, and potentially his own. The M2 flamethrower weighed nearly 70 pounds when fully loaded, and every operator knew one terrifying truth. If he was hit, even once, that fuel could turn him into a living torch. Yet despite this risk, Men volunteered for the job, driven by courage, desperation, or the grim understanding that their weapon could end a battle faster than any rifle or grenade ever could. Flamethrower operators moved like ghosts through the smoke and mud, always crouched low, always watched. German snipers learned to target them first. Those twin fuel tanks, gleaming under sunlight, were unmistakable. The moment they appeared, a storm of bullets would rain down. Still, the operators pressed forward, step by step. Inside the tank crew's world, fear was constant. The heat of the weapon on their back, the vibration of igniting fuel, the smell of gasoline that clung to their uniforms. When they fired, the recoil jolted through their body, the wave of heat nearly unbearable. Some compared it to standing in front of a furnace door, others to wielding a demon's breath. But in those few seconds of fire, they held unmatched power, able to silence entire enemy strongholds with one pull of the trigger. After each use, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. Operators would often shake as they refilled their tanks, their faces blackened with soot, eyes glassy from smoke. They knew they had survived what should have killed them, and that next time they might not. Many never made it back. A single bullet, a stray fragment, even the heat of an explosion nearby could ignite the tanks. Yet their sacrifice reshaped the battlefield. Where tanks stalled and rifles failed, the flamethrower turned impossible missions into victories. These men carried the heaviest weapon and the heaviest burden, not only of danger, but of the moral weight of what their fire left behind. In the silence after the flames died, even their own comrades stared at them with a mix of awe and unease. The moment a flamethrower operator reached the mouth of a German bunker, the jungle or battlefield around him seemed to vanish. All focus narrowed to the opening ahead, a dark, fortified space where soldiers had once believed themselves untouchable. The M2's nozzle trembled slightly in his grip as he adjusted the angle, the pressurized fuel ready to surge. One squeeze of the trigger, and a torrent of fire erupted, licking the walls, searing wood, sandbags, and the air itself. Inside, German defenders had little time to react. Their bunkers, designed to resist bullets and shrapnel, were no match for the swirling heat and roaring inferno. Smoke and flames filled the confined space, consuming wooden barricades and ammunition crates alike. Panic spread quickly. Soldiers scrambled, coughing, disoriented, often forced out into the open, where American infantry could finish the fight. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical. Even those who escaped untouched carried the memory of the flames, the roar of fuel-fed fire, the relentless advance of an enemy who seemed to hold fire in their hands. Reports from the front lines describe entire platoons surrendering after witnessing a single flamethrower breach a bunker. The fire, acting as a weapon of terror, collapsing morale faster than any artillery barrage. Meanwhile, the American infantry learned to coordinate their attacks with precision. The flamethrower operators moved in sync with riflemen and machine gunners, covering each other as they cleared trenches and pillboxes. The roar of fire was often the first sign of imminent collapse inside the enemy fortifications. Bunkers that had withstood grenades, mortars, and tank shells for weeks could be neutralized in mere minutes. Flames licked over the edges, smoke curling into the sky, and through it all, the M2 operator pressed on, fueled by adrenaline and the grim knowledge of his dangerous task. Every successful breach brought a mix of relief and dread. Relief that the mission advanced, dread that the next bunker or trench might be his last. As the firestorms spread from one bunker to the next, German soldiers began to understand the terrifying new reality of American weaponry. No longer was the M2 flamethrower just a rumor whispered among the ranks. Its devastating effect was painfully, unmistakably real. Entire defensive lines, previously thought impregnable, crumbled under the combined force of fire and infantry assault. Smoke and heat forced men from their fortified positions, exposing them to accurate rifle fire or the advancing tanks and grenades of the Americans. Commanders, previously confident in their fortifications, scrambled to adapt. Orders to hold positions became futile as the psychological toll of the flames overtook rational strategy. Soldiers who had faced artillery shells and machine gun fire now found themselves paralyzed by fear of being burned alive. Retreats turned chaotic, with units breaking formation to escape the relentless inferno consuming their bunkers. The jungle or ruined town became a maze of fleeing men, thick black smoke and flickering flames that left no safe cover. The Americans observed this shift with grim satisfaction. Each successful flamethrower strike not only destroyed material defenses, but also fractured enemy morale. Coordination and timing became crucial. Flamethrower operators worked alongside riflemen and machine gunners, exploiting every moment of confusion. Even German snipers and hidden machine gunners, who had once been able to hold key points, found themselves isolated and vulnerable as their bunkers were engulfed in fire. The message was clear and brutal. German defenses, no matter how sophisticated, could not withstand the terror and destructive power of the M2. Retreats became routes, and the once confident German troops were forced to abandon positions they had held for weeks, leaving behind ammunition, weapons, and personal effects. The battlefield was now dominated, not just by firepower, but by the psychological dominance instilled by flames that could consume anything in their path. The Americans quickly learned that the true strength of the M2 flamethrower lay not just in its raw destructive power, but in how it was integrated into coordinated assaults. Flamethrower operators worked closely with infantry squads and tank units, moving in synchronized waves that maximized both terror and tactical advantage. As one bunker erupted in fire, riflemen provided covering fire, suppressing any German soldiers attempting to escape, while tanks advanced to secure newly cleared positions. Flamethrowers were employed with surgical precision. Operators would advance under smoke screens, carefully targeting entrances, loopholes, and ventilation shafts, ensuring that the flames consumed the interior without exposing themselves to excessive risk. The M2's range and fuel capacity allowed operators to clear enemy strongpoints from a relatively safe distance. But skill and timing remained crucial. Mistimed bursts or poorly positioned operators could result in wasted fuel, missed targets, or even danger to friendly troops. From the German perspective, the battlefield became a nightmarish landscape of fire, smoke, and chaos. Defensive bunkers that had once provided confidence now became death traps. Soldiers learned quickly that hiding inside a structure offered little protection. The flames could seep through every crevice, leaving no sanctuary. Even machine gun nests, previously formidable, were neutralized as operators lobbed flames into every accessible opening. The Americans adapted to maximize psychological impact as well. Flamethrowers were often deployed alongside sudden, aggressive infantry charges, forcing German soldiers to choose between facing the fire head-on or abandoning their position entirely. The combination of fear, heat, and relentless pressure broke resistance faster than any conventional weapon could. Tactical diagrams later illustrated how small teams, using flamethrowers in tandem with rifles and grenades, could clear complex bunker networks with remarkable efficiency. By the end of these operations, it became painfully clear to German forces that the M2 was not merely a weapon. It was a force that redefined the rules of close-quarter combat. The battlefield itself seemed to bend to the operator's will, flames dictating movement, exposing vulnerabilities, and systematically eroding both fortifications and morale. The moment the first flames erupted from the M2 flamethrowers, a wave of sheer terror rippled through German soldiers entrenched in their bunkers. What had once been perceived as impenetrable fortifications instantly transformed into ovens of fear. Faces twisted in disbelief and panic, eyes darting frantically for escape routes that simply did not exist. Even the most battle-hardened veterans, accustomed to artillery barrages and tank fire, found themselves paralyzed by the searing heat and the inescapable roar of the flamethrower. The psychological impact went beyond immediate fear. It shattered defensive discipline. Soldiers who had maintained their positions for days abandoned them in chaos, crawling through narrow exits or attempting to flee across exposed terrain. The coordinated sound of flames, explosions, and gunfire created a sensory assault that disrupted focus, erased routine, and amplified confusion. Leaders tried shouting orders, but commands were drowned out by the crackling fire and the screams of those caught in its path. Even after the initial onslaught, the memory of the flamethrowers' devastation lingered. German reports described troops refusing to enter previously contested bunkers, delaying counterattacks, or demanding reassignment. It became clear that the M2 flamethrowers' effectiveness was not solely in physical destruction. It operated as a psychological weapon, eroding morale before bullets or shells even landed. By combining mechanical lethality with a calculated application of terror, American forces had weaponized fear itself. The M2 flamethrower rewrote German expectations on the battlefield, forcing commanders to reconsider entrenched strategies and compelling soldiers to face a new, terrifying reality where their safest positions were no longer safe at all. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of battle faded, commanders and soldiers alike began to assess the true impact of the M2 flamethrower. Reports from the field highlighted not only the sheer physical destruction of bunkers and fortifications, but also the profound psychological effect it had on German troops. Diagrams and after-action sketches illustrated how previously fortified positions, thought to be nearly impervious to assault, had been rendered entirely vulnerable by the combination of concentrated flame and aggressive infantry tactics. Military analysts noted that the M2's influence extended beyond individual encounters. Entire defensive strategies had to be reconsidered. Bunkers were no longer absolute sanctuaries, and entrenched soldiers hesitated where they once would have held firm. The weapon forced a re-evaluation of conventional defensive doctrine, demonstrating that firepower coupled with fear could decisively tilt engagements. Photographs and reconstructed battlefield visuals showed scorched bunkers, abandoned positions, and the aftermath of rapid American advances facilitated by flamethrower teams. The legacy of the M2 flamethrower endured well beyond the battle itself. Soldiers recounted its terrifying effectiveness in memoirs and oral histories, while tactical manuals incorporated lessons on dealing with flamethrower assaults. The psychological dimension of combat had been starkly demonstrated. Sometimes, victory was won not just through bullets and explosives, but through the ability to dominate the minds of the enemy. By the end of the campaign, it became clear that the Americans had weaponized fear with precision. The M2 flamethrower had not only burned down bunkers, it had burned away overconfidence, shattered assumptions, and rewritten the rules of engagement. Its impact was a permanent mark on military strategy, illustrating the dual power of technology and psychology on the battlefield.